and welcome to the 10th installment of a public initiative hosted by the US Asia Institute, Southeast Asia in Focus. For those of you who have attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the US Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Megan Yeo, and I am a program assistant at the US Asia Institute. For a bit of brief background, USAI is a non-partisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This specific series will provide unique opportunities for the public to engage in issues of importance to the region of Southeast Asia, targeting congressional staff, US executive branch officials, foreign diplomats, and members of the policy and business communities. As Southeast Asia continues to be a region of economic, strategic, and political importance, gaining a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities the region faces and areas for further US engagement is paramount. This briefing will provide an overview of issues surrounding the digital economy, including potential opportunities and obstacles to development, as well as the role of regional trade agreements in facilitating growth. Now, I'd like to get the briefing started with just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. The SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, and Fairfield Maxwell. And I also like to note that during the last 15 minutes or so of the briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. If you have a question that you would like our speakers to address, please type it in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me if you prefer. Now, moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the discussion, Elena Noor. Elena Noor is Director, Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director, Washington, D.C. Office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. A native of Malaysia, Elena's work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance and technology, and preventing or countering violent extremism. You'll be able to read more about Ms. Noor in our program found in the chat function. We are very fortunate to have her with us today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Ms. Noor, to introduce today's fellow panelists and continue this public briefing.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's second session of the US Asia Institute's series, Southeast Asia in Focus. To everyone calling in today from DC and around the country, thank you for joining us. We know you're all very busy, and we appreciate the time you're taking to learn about this crucial region of Asia throughout this session. As part of the Southeast Asia in Focus series, today's briefing will provide an overview of issues surrounding the digital economy, including potential opportunities and challenges to development, as well as to the role of regional trade agreements in facilitating growth. This is sure to be an interesting session. I have a personal interest in this, so I'm personally looking forward to this discussion, and I hope you are too. I'm so pleased to be joined on this panel by distinguished experts on this topic. I'd like to first introduce Mas Dandi Rafitrendi. Dandi is a researcher at the Department of Economics, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, Indonesia. I also have my friend, Greg Poling, at the other Center for Strategic International Studies here in Washington, D.C. Greg directs the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS in D.C., where he's also a senior fellow. If you're interested in learning more about speakers and myself, bios are posted in the chat function. Let's get on to the main event, today's briefing. I will begin by passing it on to Dandi for his remarks, followed by Greg. I might offer some of my own comments on the topic, but I'll save that for any questions and answers that you may have that I'll prioritize. So let's get started. Dandi, over to you. Tell us a little bit about the state of the digital economy and what's going on in the region with all things digital.
Right, thank you very much, Elena. I would like to share my screen. Okay. Is it all good?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. this is some slides just to trigger our discussion. So yeah, please do not confuse CSIS Indonesia and also CSIS DC because that's we are actually a different organization where we are actually Indonesia-based think tank, local, started founded in 1971. So actually, digital economy is growingly increase, I think, in our activity and research portfolio. I think probably in the last 5 to 6 years, I guess. Yep. So and I'm actually from the Department of Economics. So I think most of my discussion will talk about the digital economy from the economics perspective. So this is some of the research and activity that we did in our department. We look into the social aspect of the digital economy in the Eastern Indonesia, for example. If you're familiar with Indonesia, we have this, the gap between, or the inequality between the Western and Eastern Indonesia. But in this research report, we want to try look into the development of the digital economy in the Eastern Indonesia. And the second one, we also collaborating with our partners regarding the value of the applications economy. We also have a programs regarding digital ecosystem and regulatory framework in Indonesia. We also have a research on the technological transformation in Indonesia. Later on, I will explain more briefly about this. We also have a financial technology forum. We also collaborate with our partners regarding how to estimating consumer surplus in digital services platform in Indonesia. We're also talking about the digital economy in the post-COVID-19 pandemic. We'll also have this toolkit for the G20 Digital Economy Working Group this year. We're trying to do the impact of cloud services and also building a digital society index for Indonesia. A lot of things going on, but if you are interested in our work, you can also log into our website and see the research. So this is one of the research on the technological transformation. I think this is one of the research that talk about a cross-sectoral impact of digitalization and also digital innovation in the recent years. We collaborate with Asian Development Bank and other researchers as well. So yeah, you can download it, the report. But yeah, I put the link down below. So yeah, I think for the introduction, I think the region of ASEAN, I think it's very interesting and very dynamic. We have, I think so far we have 17 unicorns in ASEAN, and projected to be a $1 trillion economy in terms of the digital economy in 2030. And we also have, the changing behavior comparing between the pre and post COVID-19. You can see the development of e-commerce is going more rapidly. The education and health tech, and also digital public services after the post COVID-19. I think we're talking about the different game right now. And we also see the increasing trend of digital economy issue in international cooperation. We have this free trade agreement between countries, bilaterally and regionally. We have this mega regional trade agreements such as RCEP, CPTPP. We have the G20 and WTO. These platforms did this the digital economy is increasingly very challenging topic, I think, in this all international cooperation as well. And then lastly, I want to highlight that the digital economy is actually one of the priority economic deliverable in the ASEAN chairmanship in 2023. I think I would like to start with some factors that the that will be very crucial, that already the crucial thing that actually shaped the digital economic development in Southeast Asia. I think we have now better digital infrastructure. We also have the accelerating internet penetration. We have the growing middle class as well. And then lastly, last but not least, we have the COVID-19 pandemic disruption. I think this is also one of the reason why there is this big wave of accelerating trend of digitalization due to the restriction in mobility. And I think this is one of the index, which is the ASEAN Digital Integration Index. I think perfectly capture the gap on the state of the ASEAN digital integration. This index have, I think, six sub-index ranging from the digital trade, digital skills and talent, innovation and entrepreneurship. And you can see there's quite a big gap between the countries. And this is actually one of our concern right now, and how to make this digital economy more inclusive. And this digital economy can work for all, so that these developed countries, such as, for example, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, can actually accelerating their digital economy and improve their digital framework as well. If you noted that in terms of this index, the digital skills and talent are actually the lowest one. Yeah. So the first issue that I would like to bring that, okay, we know that the region already invests quite a lot in terms of infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and how you actually push forward, how you bridge the gap. We're talking about beyond the internet access, because probably in terms of access, ASEAN is doing pretty well. But how about the quality, the affordability and security? We know that, for example, there's quite a lot of, the cost of internet, for example, is so much higher in Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, and Vietnam in terms of their gross national income per capita. There's also a significant difference in internet quality between urban and rural. So this is also one of our priority. And the second factor that I would like to highlight is the digital literacy and skills, and how to unlock this opportunity for all to have this inclusive economic development. I think there is still measurement problems, and we should address some of the challenges, for example, rural and urban gap, and especially for vulnerable groups. We're talking about women, youth, and disability groups. In the case of e-commerce in Greater Jakarta, even this is only for Greater Jakarta, we have this survey. There's quite a lot of variety, for example, in the age group, including the question is how you actually utilize the e-commerce, whether you never use e-commerce or at least once a month, or are you a regular user? We can see the difference and the variety among groups. So this is what I'm talking about, which is the G20 Digital Literacy and Digital Skills Toolkit that we developed with the Oxford University and also UNESCAP. This is also actually one of the proposed deliverable in the G20 Digital Economy Working Group. Basically, the toolkit aimed to measure the digital literacy and digital skills status of a country, not really try to quantify or have a sort of like a rank in their digital literacy skills, but sort of like a guideline to really see how you actually measures the literacy and skills. And if we're talking about literacy and skills, we might also talking about in the perspective of the private or company. So In other words, we're talking about the technological adoption, how the company actually adopt to new technology, digitalization, they utilize e-commerce, they utilize the Industry Revolution 4.0 technology. We have this study on the technological adoption in manufacturing sector in Indonesia, and found that actually they only spend 1 to 5% of their R&D spending. And this is actually correlated with their Industry 4.0 utilization. Only 7%, I think. So we have this master plan on the Indonesia 4.0, but only 7% of firms are actually aware about the master plan. So yeah, this is just a general picture about the awareness of the Indonesian company regarding Industrial Revolution 4.0. Later on, we can move on the regulatory framework in data governance. We're talking about data governance, which is very important topic that we're talking about. And I think this is also one of the topic that have been discussed in the G20 Digital Economy and Working Group. The first one, probably we're talking about how to build trust between stakeholders. We think that this is a very important. The company, for example, really need to have a trust to the government, and also the other way around, so they can actually share the data and build the security of the data as well. And we see that there is quite a lack of coordination between ministries, especially in this case, we're talking about Indonesia. There are a lot of data types required from companies, differences in data sharing mechanisms, scope, objectives, and also government coordinators. This is very stressful, I guess, from the point of view of the private companies. And then lastly, we agreed that the data governance is a global issue, so that the international regulatory cooperation is must to be encouraged. I think this is the last aspect that I would like to discuss, which is the innovation ecosystem in the ASEAN region, which is very important. Several things that I would like to highlight is the importance of having a labor mobility to promote innovation, because we know that we have quite a lot of growing middle and productive group in ASEAN, and this labor mobility can increase their productivity and also increase their innovation as well. And regarding the innovation ecosystem, one of the key is actually the collaboration between digital company and also university or educational system. So in conclusion, if you want to have more inclusive, safe, and innovative digital economy in ASEAN, several things that we should look into it is how to move beyond the internet access, how to narrowing the digital literacy and skills gap, how to harmonize the regulatory framework, and also how to improve the innovation ecosystem. I think that's all some of the trigger slides from me. Thank you very much, Edita.
Thanks very much, Dandi. You've triggered a number of questions in my head, so that was excellent. We'll get to those questions shortly, but let me turn it over to Greg for some of your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Alina, and USAI for having me this morning. I'm going to pull a lot of my thoughts here from a report that our team at CSIS did a couple months ago on the digital economy and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where we looked at what the opportunities and barriers are for the 6 biggest economies in Southeast Asia. Unsurprisingly, we all know the digital economy is one of the most talked about potential benefits within IPEF, and whether or not the U.S. administration's thinking on this front is actually aligning with what our partners in the region want and need. So, as an American, and kind of putting myself in the place of the U.S. Trade Representative of the Commerce Department, the two big concerns for the U.S. in all of these discussions about digital economy are preventing restrictions on data localization and preventing restrictions on cross-border data flows. Those are the two big concerns for the U.S. And aligning with both of those, but not necessarily a zero-sum competition, is the questions around digital privacy, data protection, right? So there's I think a firm line in the sand that countries like the US and Japan and Singapore will draw on data localization requirements and free flow of data, cross-border data flows, and I would say more fuzzy line on data protection, because the European debate around GDPR, data protection regimes, has kind of already undermined the US position on this, whether or not Washington wants to admit it. You have US states like Virginia and California effectively already establishing their own GDPR. So when we think about the arguments around digital economy within Southeast Asia, I think it's important to recognize that just in the last few years, the ground has shifted under Washington and Tokyo and others on this. And there are clearly areas now where compromise is necessary on data protection, and clearly areas where we're still going to hold the line. And in Southeast Asia, you see this reflected in a handful of countries who still largely align with the entirely open internet position of the US and Japan, countries who increasingly are leaning toward a Chinese version of data localization, highly restrictive data transfers, basically the Chinese model of walled internet gardens. And you have most in the middle, seeking ways to establish their own versions of GDPR to protect consumer privacy, also a degree of online protectionism in an effort to compete with the Googles and the Amazons and the Apples, who feel overwhelming for a lot of local economies, but without imposing such strict data localization and transfer rules that it would impinge on the growth of the digital economy. So to lay the groundwork, what does the digital economy actually look like in Southeast Asia? Well, like on everything else, Indonesia has the largest internet economy because it has the largest economy and the largest population. I think the best reporting on this comes from Google and Temasek, their economy Southeast Asia report, the last one in 2021. They use a measure that they call gross merchandise value to describe the size of the internet economy in each of the big Southeast Asian states. And Indonesia's GMV, as they call it, was $70 billion in 2021 and expected to grow to $146 billion by 2025. And that reflected a pretty substantial bump in growth during COVID. Like everything else, like everywhere else, including in the US, businesses both large and small in Southeast Asia were forced to go online in ways they hadn't before because of COVID. So the growth rate in almost every economy in Southeast Asia between 2020 and 2021 was higher than it was in the last several years before that. This really accelerated the shift for even mom and pop businesses across the region to move online, because that's where the consumers went during COVID, and they're not coming back to brick and mortar. They are to a degree, but there has been a permanent shift towards the value of the internet economy. So Indonesia is number one. It's going to remain number one. It also has the highest growth rate because it has the largest domestic market that it's working toward. Number two in 2021 was Thailand at just 30 billion, so less than half of the size of Indonesia's internet economy. But Thailand's also seen relatively sluggish growth compared to the rest of the region. So by 2025, Thailand's internet economy is predicted to be 56 billion, not quite doubling in 4 years. Now, the fact that I described not quite doubling in 4 years as sluggish tells you how much the internet economy in the region is actually booming. Because if you look below Thailand, tied for number three were Vietnam and Malaysia, both at a GMV, a total internet economy of 21 billion. But both of them are expected to more than double by 2025. Malaysia's is also sluggish. It'll only be 35 billion. Vietnam's is exploding. Vietnam is expected to hit $56 billion by 2025, according to Google and Temasek. So that's very nearly a tripling of the size of Vietnam's digital economy in just 4 years. And then you have the Philippines. Philippines was at just 17 billion in 2021, but that's a huge increase. The Philippine internet economy very nearly doubled in a single year amid COVID, and is expected to more than double again to 40 billion by 2025. So I see a question in the chat, where's Indonesia expected to go? Indonesia's total internet economy is expected to hit $146 billion in value by 2025, which is by far the largest in the region, reflecting the fact that Indonesia is by far the largest economy in the region. Bringing up the rear, ironically, is the most developed economy. Singapore's digital economy was just $15 billion in 2021, and it'll increase to 27 billion by 2025. So what you see is the most developed economies, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, are experiencing relatively slow growth in the internet economy, just like they are in general, because they're relatively developed economies. But what that means, really, we're talking about effectively a doubling in size of their internet economies. This is booming. It's only sluggish in comparison to the really breakneck growth in the internet economies of Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, all of whom are seeing the internet economy really driving overall growth in a lot of ways. From Julian's question, why aren't developing economies seeing more as much growth? Developed economies aren't seeing as much growth because developed economies don't see as much growth overall. Right? I mean, developed economies do not grow at 5% annually. And so their internet economies don't either. Their internet economies are becoming a bigger piece of the overall economy. But, moving existing businesses online only gets you so much. In Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia, you have new businesses being born who are born in the online space. When their overall economies are growing at 5, 6, 7% post-COVID, then it's not unreasonable to expect their digital economies to also boom. So that's where we are overall, right? We have an economy or a region whose economies are already expected to experience a COVID boom, post-COVID boom, in which the digital economy will be an enormous part of that growth because those trends were already underway and then were accelerated amid COVID. The forceful transition of a lot of businesses, particularly in developing South Asia, online over the last 2 years is irreversible. So where do we stand on these debates about what the internet economy is supposed to look like in the next few years? And I will say that I think the boom in the internet economy is forcing policymakers across the region to engage with these questions in ways they really haven't proactively before, because in 2012, it was one thing for Indonesia to pass extremely strict data localization requirements when the internet economy was a very tiny part of the Indonesian economy overall. Now, policymakers in Jakarta or Hanoi or Manila have to have much more honest discussions with themselves about whether or not they are putting brakes on economic growth in favor of state control or privacy protection or what have you. So if we look at these 6 biggest internet economies in Southeast Asia, the 2 that look the most, well, really the 3 that look the most like the US or the Japanese internet economy as far as regulation are Singapore at the top and then the Philippines and Malaysia. 3 countries for whom there are no effective data localization requirements, meaning if you want to set up shop in Singapore, the Philippines, or Malaysia, you are not forced to build a server in those countries. There is effectively no cross-border restriction on data flow, so you can transfer consumer data in and out of the countries, same as you have in the US and Japan and Korea and Australia and so on. There are a variety of strict data privacy protections in these countries. Singapore has a pretty robust data privacy protection. And both Singapore and the Philippines, importantly, are members of APEC's CDPR, which is the APEC privacy rule equivalent of the GDPR in Europe, which is, of course, a much more diluted version of the GDPR. It's APEC's, US and other APEC economies' efforts to get out ahead of the trend of more strict data privacy protections. So Singapore and the Philippines are the only 2 who have explicitly signed on to the US-favored APEC CDPR regime, the cross-border data privacy regulations. And then Malaysia is largely an open shop and would likely lean that way in any case. Singapore and Malaysia, along with Brunei and Vietnam, of course, are also members of the CPTPP. The CPTPP has its own digital economy chapter, much of which was negotiated by the US Office of the Trade Representative before we walked away. It is weaker than what we later negotiated in things like the USMCA agreement and the US-Japan digital privacy agreement or digital agreement, but it's still far ahead of things like the digital economy chapters of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which basically have no binding digital economy rules at all. CPTPP does ban a lot of cross-border restrictions on cross-border data transfer and so on. And some of these countries have also signed separate bilateral agreements to this effect. Singapore has agreements with the UK and Australia and others. The Philippines is likely to negotiate a FTA with the Republic of Korea that'll include digital, a ban on restrictions on cross-border data flows and so on. So those three economies are largely already in the US camp. Next up, you have Thailand. Thailand is largely in that camp as well, but Thailand has passed regulations that would restrict cross-border data flows and impose strict privacy protections. However, it has repeatedly deferred implementation. So basically, Thailand in 2019 passed these rules that would look a lot like what you might get in Europe. And because of blowback and criticism from the US and others, they've repeatedly put that off and put that off and put that off. And it's now supposed to take effect sometime this year. Then you have Indonesia. So Indonesia and Vietnam are the two, from the US perspective, problems here. Indonesia's problems are perhaps more intractable because I think they're made in kind of good faith arguments that the US will have to deal with. So Indonesia in 2012 imposed a presidential decree that, among other things, required data localization. Companies had to come build servers in Indonesia. That was a problem increasingly as Indonesia watched companies decide to invest in other places, Malaysia, Singapore, et cetera, for their Southeast Asian businesses rather than invest in Indonesia. So in 2019, you had Indonesia pass another government regulation that watered down some of those requirements from 2012. So today, Indonesia doesn't, on paper necessarily, at least at a national level, require data localization. It does still have restrictions on cross-border data flows. And there's a lot of competing government regulations that come out that, let's just say, have companies unsure where the winds are blowing in Indonesia. It seems that every 6 months there's a new regulation that contradicts the one previously. So a lot of, I think, companies still just don't feel particularly confident investing in the Indonesian digital economy. What we do know is that the overall narrative within Indonesia, as it is on most things in the economy, leans heavily into protectionist tropes. So you hear a lot of arguments about, Indonesia needs strict data localization rules in order to protect domestic companies from unfair competition from both Chinese and American internet giants. President Jokowi likes to talk about this, among others. And Indonesia has adopted what is the closest equivalent to the GDPR system in Southeast Asia. Indonesia has pretty strict data privacy regulations that a lot of Western companies don't like. And then you have the Vietnam model. Vietnam has leaned increasingly toward the Chinese model of the internet, the data sovereignty model in which the state controls access to and data flows of its citizens. And this is problematic, and I think causing an active debate within the Vietnamese government because they know that this is not necessarily what their major investors, Korea, Japan, US companies want or are comfortable with. So in Vietnam, you had in 2018 a law on cybersecurity, which clearly violates Vietnam's obligations under the CPTPP, but so far nobody has taken them to arbitration, probably because the US isn't there and the US is the only one who would have taken them to arbitration. The law on cybersecurity, among other things, required data localization. That was watered down a bit with a subsequent cybersecurity decree. And then last year, 2021, you had a personal data protection decree that has yet to go into effect, all of which seems to suggest that Vietnam is headed toward a system of both strict data localization, so you have to build your servers in Vietnam, and pretty strict cross-border data flow restrictions. So Vietnamese citizens their data cannot leave the country if they haven't kind of explicitly given permission, and there's reciprocity in the other country, and there's a viable reason for it, all of which has companies quite nervous that Vietnam is heading toward kind of a walled garden, which is going to ultimately crimp that booming internet economy that we talked about. So for the US, what does all this mean? Very briefly, when it comes to IPEF, whether or not we actually include digital economy in the trade pillar of IPEF as it currently is, where it's going to die a slow death, or we decide to break it out into an actually useful individual pillar, that commerce and USTR could negotiate with our partners. If you broke it out, you would find that Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines would all very readily agree to a US Japanese led digital economy pillar to lock in these rules. And Thailand is probably still gettable for the US, a way to divert Thailand from going a little, in the US opinion, too far on the data private or data privacy consumer protection side. Indonesia and Vietnam are not gettable. Whether you're bundling the digital economy into an IPEF trade pillar or you're keeping it separate, Indonesia and Vietnam are just not going to buy in, at least in the absence of market access. Vietnam did under CPTPP, and then it got burned when the US walked away. It's not going to do it now without market access. And for Indonesia, I said Indonesia are more intractable because I think even if you offered market access, Indonesia is not going to walk away from its focus on, kind of online protectionism to a degree, supporting its own domestic businesses, even if that means slowing the overall economy. And it is very serious and honest about its concerns around consumer protection. So it is going to have a European-style GDPR regime, no matter what the US does. That was a lot. So I think I'm just going to shut up and look forward to Q&A.
That's great, Greg. There are a couple of questions that have already come in, either through chat, which Greg has very deftly handled, but also in the Q&A box. So I'd like to encourage those of you online, if you have any questions or comments, other interventions, feel free to post them in the Q&A box. If you feel more inclined to do it in the chat box, I will also monitor that. But the preference is to post your comments, questions in the Q&A box. One of the issues with talking about the digital economy is that it's so wide-ranging. It crosses into very different dimensions and angles, some of which both Dandi and Greg have already touched on. I have a few, actually more than a few questions of my own, but maybe I'll give the screen to Dandi to respond to Greg, if you wish, Dandi, to any of the comments that Greg has made so far.
Right. Thank you very much, Elena. I think I'm not an expert in the the international relations and also the regarding the international cooperation, but I do have several questions to me regarding IPEF, the new platform that have been introduced from the US to several countries, I think selected countries. Interestingly, I think our government have this positive approach to it and seeing this as an opportunity, I think, to engage in more dynamic digital economy with the US and also India. So I think it's a very interesting platform, and one of the topic and one of the issues, one of the focus of the IPEF is digital economy. And I think connecting between important countries, for example, ASEAN and India, and of course Indonesia, will be very beneficial for the region. And we also look into more, what's on the table, and how much resources that are going to be mobilized, for example. And we I think we as a think tank in Indonesia, we also supported this kind of we also open for this kind of international cooperation, and we really look forward to engage in the discussion also.
Thank you, Dandi. So a number of questions they range from kind of the big picture geopolitics questions to some of the slightly more detailed ones. There was one that came in on the big picture angle about how the American economy and culture intertwines at all with the Asian economy and culture. And what areas and interests do both Southeast Asia and the US share on the digital market, specifically as a free trade democratic republic, I assume this is a reference to the US, in juxtaposition to the US's Chinese counterparts. So I guess if I'm paraphrasing a little bit, it goes to the whole democratic authoritarian lens through which sometimes the digital economy is viewed. Dante, would you like to start us off on a response, and I'll turn to Greg?
Right. Well, yeah. That's not really my my research focus, but I would like to point at some of the difference approach. For example, if you're talking about the China approach, for example, and also the US approach of the digital economy. But talking about, for example, investment in digital infrastructure as well, I think Indonesia is relatively open to it. So both from, for example, we know apart from IPF, we have this China digital infrastructure investment plan, about the digital Silk Road, I think, sort of like the digital BRI, where they want to invest quite a lot of digital infrastructure. But knowing all of that, we have a lot of options. I think it's good for the government. But of course, the government need to think more strategically. For example, what kind of, for example, technology, what kind of approach of the regulation that we want to go with, whether we want to go with the China approach or the US approach. But right now, I think we don't really see the digital economy landscape as that, right? I mean, there's a two approach and etc. But we're thinking about really how's our interests actually included in that kind of plan. So yeah, that's actually my answer.
Yeah, and I want to get back to this whole idea of not picking from different models, for example,
Right.
already out there, but also crafting Southeast Asia's own. But before I do, Greg, response from you?
Yeah, it's a tough question. So I guess I think about it like this. I think there are two tracks on which we could argue about the kind of digital culture in different models, whether it's a US, China, European. Because there is the narrative often put out that countries are kind of stuck choosing between these three, right? Do you want a completely open, neoliberal economy? Do you want a Chinese walled garden in which we only talk to each other when governments allow? Or do you want, a European model in which if you, I don't know, get hit by a car, you have to sign 12 forms online before they're allowed to take you to the hospital, all of which are, of course, caricatures of those regimes in each country. And they're not really arguing about the same thing. With the sole exception, perhaps, of Vietnam, I don't see much appetite in Southeast Asia for the Chinese model of digital sovereignty, meaning kind of purposely blocking citizens from access to online spaces, controlling data flows, requiring data localization in order to assert state control. I mean, of course, individual politicians might like that, but I see very little national level appetite for it outside of Vietnam. Then the second argument about digital privacy and consumer protection and competition, that's where there's kind of honest debates being had within each country, including in the US. I mean, the US government might view these things as black and white, but go to the average, US citizen in Colorado or California or Virginia, where they live under effectively a GDPR regime, and they're going to have the exact same complaints about consumer protection and unfair practices by Google and Apple, that you'll hear in Indonesia. Except in Indonesia, you also hear the same complaints about, Alibaba and WeChat Pay. And so they have to deal with it from both sides. So I think we are in a place where consumer protections online in particular have to evolve at the demands of citizens, and citizens in Southeast Asia are making the exact same demands that citizens here are.
Yeah, and I think it's point out that it's not as reductive as it sometimes seems, right? This narrative of choosing between different models, because those models are not even concretized in some places just yet. You see it evolving even in China now, Europe as well. Danny, you had talked a little bit about vulnerable groups, and I think that was listed in one of your slides as well. One of the questions that has come up in the Q&A box is, how do you balance between privacy control and the growth of the digital economy? How do you balance that, and I guess the advancement of women in Southeast Asia?
Right. Yeah, this is a very important topic as well, because we highlighted the importance of having a right toolkit to really measure, the literacy, the security, how safe is the cyberspace for vulnerable groups, including women, youth, and also children. And I don't think that we have effort to really push forward this agenda. I think some of the discussions are still having the economic growth, how to empower women, for example, included in e-commerce, but the government and the discussion is not really talking about what are actually the risks of having, including in the e-commerce. I think that's one of the homework for the region, and this agenda should be moved forward in our discussion.
Right, it's not just women though as well, right? I mean, in Southeast Asia, many of our countries have a mixed population, very diverse population, right, including indigenous populations, minority communities that have a very right different view of data privacy, protection of data, even the notion of data and whether it should be protected or right not. Right. And that's a whole different conversation, which I'm sure economists like you are also debating, this notion of social justice and economics.
Yeah, so that's correct.
It's a very interesting discussion. I think that has yet to have been fully developed in Southeast Asia. Correct. I'm not sure if it's even been seeded, and especially with a country like Indonesia, right? 17,000 islands, how many different ethnicities and sub-ethnicities, so many languages. Right. Are these some of the things that you're grappling with in the G20 track on the digital economy, Dandy?
Yes, obviously, because I think this is also one of our concern, because we see this the dimension of inequality in terms of we're talking about the economic inequality from the vulnerable groups, but how whether this digital economy can actually widening the inequality, right? I think that's actually one of the thing that we should address, how this digital inclusion should be put forward, and I think the toolkit that we developed is actually one of the how we start to do some efforts to actually track the variety of the vulnerable groups, and not really going into the growth of the digital economy per se, but we also need to know the distribution of the digital economic cake in terms of the digital economy. Yep.
Greg, maybe I can put you on the spot. Do you think that the US is doing enough of this, pushing this whole notion of social justice, digital inclusion? Is it doing a good enough job in reaching out to its Southeast Asian partners through initiatives like IPEF?
The Biden administration certainly talks a good game about digital inclusion and, particularly inclusion of women and minority communities, both domestically and internationally. The problem is I'm not sure that the administration yet understands how that's connected to its international agenda, right? So it's one thing to say that the economy pillar of the IPEF will include a focus on marginalized communities. But what exactly does that mean in policy terms? I have no idea. I will say, let me make a broader point here about these arguments about digital economy. Very early on, when people would go to the Biden administration and say, you need to sign a digital economy agreement, right? You don't want to get back into TPP, finally get it. So why don't you join BIPA or some other digital economy partnership to at least show that you're willing to engage on economic rulemaking again? And the response would often be, well, we can't because people will see that as a giveaway to big tech. And right, because TPP was a giveaway to big pharma and everybody else. And so any digital economy agreement must naturally be a giveaway to big tech. And you hear similar arguments from, members of the Jacoby administration. But the fact is that whatever the rules are, doesn't matter as much as the fact that there is one set of rules. So if you are a small business owner, and I don't care who you are or what your background is, if you are a small business owner anywhere other than Indonesia, basically, where you have a large enough domestic economy that you can sell to, then it is in your interest to have a standard set of rules. What those rules are less important than the fact that they be standardized, because what GDPR did in Europe, well, everybody outside of Europe might complain about it. The fact is you have to have one lawyer who's familiar with GDPR and you can sell to 28 countries. If you are a small business owner in Malaysia or Thailand or the Philippines and you want to sell throughout the Indo-Pacific, you are going to need a lawyer for every single country in the Indo-Pacific. That is a barrier to entry, an enormous one, more so than anything else. And Google doesn't care. I promise Google has enough lawyers to make sure that they're in compliance with every local digital protection regime. A mom and pop shop from Malaysia trying to sell something online is not going to be able to afford the compliance cost of making sure that they are in alignment with every single one of these different data privacy regimes.
I feel such regret that I dropped my legal training to not be a lawyer in this age. Greg, I know you have to jump off on the hour. Is there any other thing, any final thoughts you just want to put out there for us to think about?
I'll just add again, if the US is serious about IPEF, the best way to make IPEF a real rulemaking venture is to add a fifth pillar on the digital economy, because the trade pillar, as currently written, is only going to include the US, Japan, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, and maybe Korea. I don't care what they put in it. I don't care what they do over the next year. Nobody else, none of the other 9 countries are going to sign on to it. If they break the digital economy pillar out, they can probably get at least 3 and maybe 4 other Southeast Asian economies to join.
All right, Dandy, I'd like your response to that, but there's also a question for you, I guess, about the more isolationist methods of Indonesian, and in the question it says Vietnamese digital economies. How does that play out? Is it an advantage or disadvantage to cybersecurity and cyber warfare? This is not part of your toolkit of expertise, completely understandable, but we'd like to take a stab at it. I'm sure a response will be appreciated.
Right. I'm not sure whether I interpret this isolationist as having a domestic or inward looking, for example.
Yeah, I think inward looking is what they get.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think I have this discussion about inward looking in terms of the digital economy approach. I think this is also one of the the reason why we have this statement, data is the new oil. So maybe all of the government now thinking data is actually a resources. So if you can keep it as long as you want, you can get richer. But that's not actually the way data and the digital economy works, right? They don't really see the value of data sharing, for example. And they're thinking that if Indonesia can keep all of the data inside of Indonesia, it will be more beneficial for them. It will be much safer for the economy as well. So I think there are quite a lot of misconceptions regarding the digital economy as well, that actually make them make their lack of knowledge and then going into the the inward looking and domestic looking of digital economy approach.
Yeah, there are a number of resources on arguing for the fact that actually a more open economy makes for safer cybersecurity.
Right.
And those are available online as resources. But I think there's this larger question of what exactly it is the region, Southeast Asia, is hoping to achieve with digitalizing the economy and government transformation as well. There seems to be this mad race towards everything digital, but there are many aspects I think that those of us Southeast Asians haven't yet fully unpacked that we really need to. And a sort of a plug, if I will, my organization is releasing a report on data and AI in Southeast Asia this Wednesday, actually. So 2 days from now, we get into some of these questions, some of these lesser discussed questions. And you can see this angst, anxiety playing out between how to preserve privacy and data of individuals, but also trying to grow the economy and ensure innovation at the same time. Greg mentioned Thailand. Thailand actually just very recently enforced its PDPA as of 1st of June. So the only outstanding economy seems to be Vietnam in terms of a comprehensive data protection law so far. And then I think there are also nuances in the Indonesian digital economy that sometimes gets lost in some of the mainstream narratives. But we're almost approaching the hour. We have 1 minute left. So let me turn it back to Megan for some final announcements. Thank you so much to Greg and Dandy for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you. Ms. No, I greatly appreciate you stepping in to moderate today. Giving both your perspective and leading our discussion today was fascinating to listen to. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Mr. Rafichandi and Mr. Poling for joining us and providing their excellent insight. Thank you also to Mr. Rafichandi for joining us at night in Indonesia. We were honored to host you, and we appreciate the time you have taken out of your busy schedules to deliver your valuable perspectives. And though we are out of time, we present the opportunity for those tuning in with interest in US-Asia relations to reach out to the USAI if they have questions relevant to our future events for this public webinar series. If anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us at usai@usasiainstitute.org, and we will be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues we discussed today. For congressional staff in our audience tuning in today interested in other Southeast Asia related matters, USAI is currently holding its ASEAN 101 Congressional Briefing Series. ASEAN 101 provides unique insight into the US-ASEAN relationship, featuring speakers with first-hand knowledge of the region. This program seeks to provide expert analysis for those working on or personally interested in issues concerning ASEAN and US-ASEAN relations. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.